The first sound was not gunfire. It was silence. A cold wind moved through the dark pine trees as dawn slowly approached. Frost covered the frozen ground. Every breath became a cloud in the bitter December air. Somewhere beyond the forest, hundreds of German soldiers were getting into position.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
Rifles were checked one last time. Machine guns were loaded. Officers studied maps under dim flashlight beams. They believed this would be another quick attack. The Americans ahead were too few to stop them. They were wrong. Hidden among shallow foxholes and broken tree lines were only 18 American soldiers. 18 tired men who had already spent days fighting in freezing weather. They had little sleep, limited ammunition, and no idea exactly how many Germans were coming toward them. What they did know was simple. If they abandoned this position, an important road behind them could fall into German hands. More American lives would be placed in danger. Retreat was possible. Surrender was possible. But neither choice was made. What happened over the next several hours became one of those incredible moments in the Second World War that still leaves military historians asking the same question. How could such a tiny group of defenders hold against hundreds of attacking soldiers? The answer was not luck alone. It was leadership, discipline, terrain, training, and the courage of ordinary men who refused to believe the battle was already lost. The winter of 1944 was one of the hardest periods of the war in Western Europe. On 16 December 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive in the West. The attack would later become known as the Battle of the Bulge. German armored divisions and infantry smashed through the Ardennes Forest in Belgium and Luxembourg, hoping to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. Snow covered the roads. Thick forests blocked visibility. Radios often failed. Small groups of soldiers suddenly found themselves isolated from friendly units. Many fought without knowing where the front line truly was. Among those scattered American units were small detachments ordered to delay the German advance for as long as possible. Every minute mattered. Every crossroads mattered. Every hill and every patch of forest could decide how quickly German columns moved west. The 18 Americans in this story were not famous before that winter. They came from different towns, different families, and different jobs back home. One had worked on a farm, another had been a mechanic. One dreamed of returning to college after the war. Another had become a father only months before leaving for Europe. None expected history to remember their names. They only expected to do their duty. Their officer understood something many young commanders never fully accepted. Numbers alone did not decide battles. Position, preparation, and confidence often mattered more than raw strength. He walked quietly from foxhole to foxhole before daylight, speaking to each man. Faces were tired, gloves were wet, boots were frozen, yet no one left his position. The ground itself offered one important advantage. A narrow stretch of rising terrain overlooked the most likely German approach. Pine trees limited visibility. Fallen logs created natural cover. Frozen earth made digging difficult, but the shallow fighting positions were enough to protect a soldier lying flat. The Americans carefully placed their automatic weapons where overlapping fields of fire could cover nearly every open space in front of them. One machine gun crew checked their weapon again and again. They understood that if their guns stopped firing, the entire defense could collapse. Nearby, riflemen counted their remaining ammunition. Nobody had enough for a long battle. Every shot would have to count. As daylight slowly spread across the forest, the first signs of movement appeared. A distant branch snapped. Then another. The woods seemed alive. At first, nothing could be clearly seen. The Germans moved carefully through the trees, using patrols to locate American positions before committing larger forces. Experienced American observers resisted the temptation to fire too early. Every man remained still despite the growing tension. The waiting became almost unbearable. Then one helmet appeared between the trees. Another followed. Soon dozens of gray uniforms emerged from the forest. The Americans still did not fire. The German soldiers continued forward with growing confidence. Their officers believed they faced only scattered resistance. Behind the leading companies, more infantry advanced, followed by machine gun teams and supporting weapons. The attack gathered strength with every passing minute. Only when the leading Germans entered the open ground did the American commander give the signal. The silence exploded. Rifle fire cracked across the frozen hillside. Automatic weapons ripped through the morning air. German soldiers immediately dropped to the ground, searching for cover that barely existed. The carefully prepared American fields of fire forced the attackers into deadly open spaces where every movement became dangerous. The first assault stopped almost instantly. German officers quickly reorganized their men. They had expected frightened defenders. Instead, they encountered disciplined fire from positions that seemed far stronger than intelligence had suggested. For several minutes, the battlefield became strangely quiet again. The Americans knew what that silence meant. The next attack would be larger. One young rifleman wiped frozen sweat from his face while carefully reloading. His hands shook, not from fear alone, but from the cold. Nearby, another soldier checked on a wounded friend before returning to his firing position without saying a word. Nobody wasted movement. Nobody wasted ammunition. Far behind the German front, commanders studied reports arriving from the attack. The message surprised them. Resistance was much stronger than expected. More troops were requested. Additional machine guns moved forward. Mortar crews prepared firing data. The Americans could not see any of this. They only heard the first incoming mortar rounds. The explosions threw frozen dirt, snow, and broken branches high into the air. Tree trunks shattered under the blasts. Sharp splinters flew like knives through the forest. Veterans feared exploding timber almost as much as enemy bullets. A man safely hidden from gunfire could still be killed by flying wood. The shelling continued. Communication became difficult as smoke drifted through the trees. One foxhole disappeared beneath falling earth. Another soldier suffered a concussion from a nearby explosion but refused evacuation because there was nowhere safe to go. Then the second German assault began. This time the attackers advanced from multiple directions, hoping to divide the defenders. Small groups moved from tree to tree while machine guns fired continuously to keep American heads down. Mortars exploded closer than before. German officers pushed their men forward despite growing casualties. The 18 defenders answered with controlled fire. Their officer constantly shifted riflemen to reinforce weak points. A machine gun that had been covering the left side was carefully redirected toward the center where the greatest danger appeared. Ammunition was passed from one foxhole to another by crawling through shallow depressions in the frozen ground. One soldier noticed German infantry attempting to reach a cluster of fallen logs only 70 yards away. If they succeeded, they would gain excellent cover for the next assault. Without waiting for orders, he carefully aimed, fired several accurate shots, and forced the entire group to withdraw. Small actions like that slowly changed the battle. Every decision mattered. Every minute bought valuable time for American forces farther behind the lines. As the fighting continued, the German commanders became increasingly frustrated. Reports described defenders firing from several different positions. To the attackers, it seemed impossible that so much resistance could come from so few men. Some believed they faced an entire platoon or even a company. The carefully spaced American positions created an illusion of much greater strength. The deception was never planned. It happened because disciplined soldiers refused to fire wildly. Instead of everyone shooting at once, they engaged different targets from different positions. The Germans heard gunfire coming from multiple directions and naturally assumed many more Americans occupied the ridge. Late in the morning, another danger appeared. One of the American machine guns suddenly stopped firing. For a terrifying moment, the center of the defense fell silent. German soldiers immediately recognized the opportunity and rushed forward across the snow. The gun crew worked desperately to clear the malfunction. Frozen metal, dirt, and heavy use had jammed the weapon at exactly the wrong moment. Nearby riflemen increased their own rate of fire to protect the crew while they struggled to get the gun working again. Seconds felt like minutes. The advancing Germans closed the distance. Then, with a sharp burst, the machine gun roared back to life. The attack broke apart once again. Bodies lay scattered across the white ground where moments earlier confident soldiers had charged forward, believing victory was finally within reach. The 18 Americans were still holding. But each man knew something the Germans did not. Their ammunition was running dangerously low. The next attack might be the one they could no longer stop. By early afternoon, the battlefield looked completely different from the quiet forest that had existed only hours earlier. The snow had turned gray with dirt and smoke. Broken branches covered the ground. The sharp smell of burned gunpowder hung in the freezing air. Every American foxhole carried the marks of constant shellfire. The defenders were exhausted, cold, and hungry, yet none of them had left their position. The officer moved carefully between the surviving fighting positions whenever enemy fire slowed. He counted ammunition without writing anything down. There was no need. The numbers were already burned into his memory. Some riflemen had only a few clips remaining. Machine gun belts were nearly empty. Hand grenades had become precious. Every bullet now had to solve a problem. There could be no wasted fire. Across the battlefield, the German commanders faced a different problem. Their attacks had failed again and again, but they still did not understand why. Prisoners had not been captured. American radio traffic had been limited. The defenders seemed to appear everywhere at once. Reports from different companies described heavy resistance from several directions. Some officers estimated they were facing more than 100 Americans. Others believed hidden reinforcements had arrived during the morning. No one imagined that only 18 men still held the line. The Germans changed their tactics once more. Instead of advancing in one large wave, they divided into smaller assault groups. Machine guns laid down covering fire while riflemen crawled through the trees trying to reach the American flank. Mortars continued to pound the ridge. Every explosion shook the frozen earth. You can almost feel the ground trembling beneath the defenders as another shell lands only yards away, covering uniforms and weapons with snow and dirt. One American soldier spotted movement on the right side. German infantry had discovered a shallow depression leading toward the ridge. If they reached it, they could fire directly into several foxholes. Without waiting for orders, 2 riflemen shifted to a new position, crawling through icy mud while bullets snapped overhead. They reached the threatened flank only moments before the attackers appeared. Their accurate fire forced the Germans back into the trees, closing the gap before it became a disaster. Another defender had been fighting since dawn with a wounded arm wrapped tightly beneath his jacket. Every time he fired his rifle, pain shot through his shoulder. He ignored it. Around him, every man understood that someone else depended on his position. If one foxhole fell silent, The next one became harder to defend. They were not 18 separate soldiers anymore. They had become one connected defensive line. Hours passed. The Germans attacked again, and again. Each assault reached a little closer than the last. The Americans could see faces now instead of distant helmets. Individual figures rushed between trees. Grenades exploded close enough to shower the defenders with frozen dirt. Rifle barrels became hot despite the bitter winter air. Fingers grew numb. Reloading took longer. Even simple movements demanded enormous effort. Still, the line held. The secret was not extraordinary strength. It was extraordinary discipline. Whenever the Germans concentrated on one section, the Americans shifted their fire. Whenever an enemy machine gun opened up, every available rifle targeted it. The defenders refused to panic. They fought with the patience they had learned through months of training and combat. Every soldier trusted the men beside him. That trust proved stronger than numbers. As daylight slowly faded, the battlefield presented the Germans with another difficult reality. Every attack cost more casualties. Every delay gave American commanders farther to the west more time to organize new defensive positions and move reinforcements toward threatened roads. What had begun as a seemingly simple objective had turned into an expensive struggle against defenders who refused to disappear. German officers finally ordered another concentrated mortar barrage before attempting one last push. Shells burst across the ridge with terrifying force. Tree trunks shattered. Snow erupted into the air. For several minutes it seemed impossible that anyone could still be alive inside those shallow foxholes. When the shelling stopped, German infantry advanced once more. The ridge answered with gunfire. Not as much as before, not as fast as before, but enough. The Americans fired only when they had clear targets. Some waited until attackers entered open ground before squeezing the trigger. Others held their last grenades until German soldiers closed within dangerous distance. Every round now carried enormous value. The defenders were fighting almost entirely on judgment rather than firepower. The final assault slowed. Then it stopped. The German soldiers once again pulled back into the forest. Silence returned to the ridge. No one celebrated. The Americans knew the battle might begin again at any moment. They remained alert, watching every tree line while checking on the wounded and redistributing the last of their ammunition. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. The expected attack never came. German commanders had reached a difficult conclusion. Continuing to assault that position would cost more lives than it was worth. Their timetable had already been disrupted. Other objectives demanded attention. The stubborn little pocket of resistance had delayed experienced formations far longer than anyone had predicted. Only after friendly American forces reached the position did the full story become clear. The relief troops expected to find a large defensive force. Instead, they found only 18 exhausted soldiers. Many had not eaten properly for hours. Several were wounded. Their uniforms were torn. Their faces were blackened by smoke. Empty ammunition boxes lay scattered across the frozen ground. Yet the ridge remained in American hands. The officers who arrived could hardly believe what they were seeing. Reports from the German side suggested they had been fighting a much larger force. Careful fire control, intelligent positioning, and determined leadership had created an illusion that fooled repeated assaults throughout the day. Stories like this remind us that the Second World War was not decided only by famous generals, massive tank battles, or strategic bombing campaigns. Again and again, the outcome depended on small groups of ordinary soldiers standing their ground in places that rarely appeared on maps. A crossroads, a wooded ridge, a frozen hill. Sometimes those places delayed an entire advance. Sometimes they protected thousands of other men farther behind the lines. Military historians often point to several reasons why heavily outnumbered defenders could survive against larger attacking forces. Good terrain reduced the enemy's numerical advantage. Prepared fighting positions provided protection. Clear fields of fire forced attackers into exposed ground. Well-trained soldiers conserved ammunition instead of firing wildly. Above all, strong leadership kept fear from becoming panic. The Battle of the Bulge produced many famous stories of courage. Some involved entire divisions. Others centered on small patrols or isolated roadblocks. Each demonstrated the same truth. Determination alone could not win every battle. But determination combined with discipline, preparation, and intelligent tactics could change events far beyond the size of the force involved. For the 18 Americans, there were no cameras waiting when the fighting ended. No dramatic speeches echoed across the frozen forest. Their reward was simply seeing another sunrise. They gathered their wounded, counted the missing, cleaned their weapons, and prepared for whatever came next. That was the reality of war. Even extraordinary courage rarely brought immediate celebration. The German soldiers who attacked that ridge also deserve to be remembered as professionals carrying out difficult orders under terrible conditions. They advanced repeatedly through deadly fire because that was their mission. Many never returned home. Their failure was not caused by a lack of bravery. It was caused by the harsh mathematics of attacking well-positioned defenders who refused to break. Decades later, battlefields like this remain quiet. The shell holes have filled with earth. Trees have grown where foxholes once stood. Snow still falls across the Ardennes each winter, covering the ground much as it did in 1944. Visitors walking those forests today may never realize that, on one freezing day, a handful of determined Americans held back a force many times their size and bought precious time when every minute mattered. History often remembers the largest armies and the loudest victories. Yet sometimes its greatest lessons come from the smallest groups. 18 tired soldiers did not stop because the odds were fair. They stayed because they believed the ground behind them was worth defending. Against hundreds of attackers, with ammunition almost gone and no guarantee of survival, they proved that courage is not measured by numbers. On that frozen ridge, 18 Americans accomplished something 500 German soldiers could not overcome. That is why their stand continues to be remembered, not as a legend beyond belief, but as a powerful reminder that in war, discipline, leadership, and unwavering resolve can make a handful of defenders seem like an army.